1. d4 is a strong central pawn move that opens diagonals for the queen and bishop and prepares to fight for control of the center, often leading to queen's pawn openings which prioritize solid positional play and flexible development. This move, nf6, is a fundamental developing move that challenges white's central pawn and prepares to castle, leading to a vast array of established opening systems like the Indian defenses. This move prepares to establish central pawn control and potentially transpose into popular openings like the Queen's Gambit or Indian defenses, aiming to restrict black's development and create attacking chances. This move, black c6, transitions the game towards a Queen's Indian defense or a Nimzo Indian setup, preparing to develop the kingside bishop and support a future d5 pawn break. This move prepares to fianchetto the king's bishop to g2, reinforcing the center and creating potential attacking pressure along the long diagonal. This move firmly establishes the central pawn presence, challenging white's queenside expansion and aiming to control key central squares, which is a common objective in many queen's pawn openings. The bishop on g2 now exerts strong pressure along the long diagonal, controlling key central squares and preparing to support the central pawn push, typical of Catalan-style setups. This move develops the bishop to a natural square, preparing to castle and reinforcing the central pawn structure against white's fianchettoed setup. This move develops a knight, reinforcing control of the central squares and preparing for kingside castling, while keeping options open for various continuations within the Catalan or Queen's Indian complex. Castling is a crucial developing move that secures the king and connects the rooks, actively preparing for the middle game. This move develops the queen to support the d4 pawn and prepare for the central pawn break with c5. This move initiates a queen's gambit decline structure, challenging white's central control and aiming to liberate black's queenside pawns. Castling kingside consolidates the king's safety and connects the rooks, preparing for potential central pawn breaks or operations on the queenside. Black resolves the central tension, aiming to gain time for piece development and potentially exploit the open c-file once white recaptures. This recapture resolves the central tension, opening lines for piece activity and setting up white to potentially challenge black's central pawn control. Developing the knight to c6 reinforces the central pawn on d5 and prepares to contest the central squares, a standard response in many queen's pawn game structures. This exchange simplifies the position, opening the c-file for potential future play and creating a structural imbalance by leaving black with doubled pawns on the c-file. This move recaptures the pawn and establishes a doubled pawn structure, which, while weakening the pawn chain, opens the b-file for the rook and creates potential for central pawn play. This move prepares to develop the queen's bishop to a more active square, typically b2, to support the queenside pawn structure and potentially pressure black's weaknesses. The bishop on a6 actively contests the c4-7 diagonal, targeting white's pawn structure and potentially disrupting white's development plans. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, controlling the important long diagonal and supporting potential pawn advances in the center. This move aggressively contests the open c-file and prepares to challenge white's queenside pawn structure. This move prepares to develop the king's bishop to a more active square, typically e2 or d3, and supports the central pawn on d4 while reinforcing the queenside structure. This move prepares to exchange the opponent's strong light-squared bishop, which is currently a key defender of white's kingside, and simultaneously puts pressure on the d4 pawn. This move begins redeploying the knight to a more active central square, likely aiming to support a d4-d5 pawn push or to join an attack on black's queenside pawn structure. Developing the rook to the d-file prepares for potential pressure along this open file and supports the central pawn structure. This move places a rook on the d-file, reinforcing control of the now semi-open file and preparing for potential action against black's doubled c-pawns or to support a kingside advance. The knight repositions to a more active square, aiming to join the kingside attack and potentially control the e5 square. White reinforces the c-file and prepares potential queenside expansion or pressure. A typical response in this Queen's Indian structure where black has a queenside pawn majority. The move b-flat-7 intends to reinforce the d5 pawn and prepare for the bishop to potentially swing over to the queenside for defensive or attacking purposes, while also freeing up the c8 square for a rook. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to support a potential kingside advance or to contest the e5 square in the future. This move challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to open the c-file for black's rook and potentially disrupt white's coordination after dx-c5. The knight boldly ventures to e5, aiming to exploit the weakened light squares on black's kingside and potentially create threats against the d7 knight or f7 pawn. This exchange simplifies the pawn structure, with black aiming to improve their knight's scope and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. This bishop recapture on e5 solidifies white's central control and opens the d-file for potential knight activity. This pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's central control, open lines for black's pieces, and potentially create weaknesses in white's pawn structure. This pawn exchange opens the e-file and centralizes white's pawn, potentially leading to a more dynamic middle game where attacking opportunities on the open file can be exploited. This exchange simplifies the position and removes a key defender of white's queenside pawn structure, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn chain. King recapture is essential to consolidate the center and prepare for further pawn advances, leveraging the open file for the rook. This move aims to destabilize white's central pawn structure and create attacking opportunities on the kingside by breaking the pawn chain. The bishop retreats to the safe square of f4 to maintain the bishop pair and support the central pawn push, preparing to contest the open c-file. This pawn sacrifice opens the c-file and aims to activate black's queenside pawns, challenging white's central control and potentially creating weaknesses. This move aims to centralize the queen and potentially prepare for exchanges, while also creating threats against black's weakened kingside pawns. This move decisively challenges white's central control and opens lines for black's pieces, creating dynamic play at the cost of some pawn structure concessions. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control key squares and support the kingside while defending against black's central pawn thrust. This move activates the bishop on a powerful long diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially attack the b2 pawn. This move repositions the rook to defend the b2 bishop, which is under attack and crucial for controlling the a1-h8 diagonal, while preparing for potential pawn pushes on the queenside. This pawn advance aims to create queenside space and potentially initiate an exchange of pieces, while preparing for potential pawn pushes like b5 in the future. The bishop repositions to c1, preparing to contest the open c-file and support a potential advance of the b-pawn, while also providing a defensive anchor against black's queenside initiative. The bishop retreats to f8 to defend the weakened e7 square and prepare for potential pawn advances. On the kingside, while white consolidates his queenside pressure, this pawn thrust initiates a kingside attack, aiming to create weaknesses in black's pawn structure and open lines for white's pieces. This move re-centralizes the queen, preparing to contest the open c-file and potentially support a pawn advance on the kingside or meet white's aggressive pawn push. This move repositions the rook to a more active square on the second rank, preparing to potentially double rooks on the b-file or support advances on the queenside. This move initiates a pawn lever with g6, aiming to create a more active position for black's king and potentially open lines for counterplay against white's queenside pawn majority, while also preparing to challenge white's central control. This move repositions the rook to the second rank, anticipating an exchange on the e-file or potential support for a kingside pawn advance. The move qd7 aims to reposition the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting pawn advances on the kingside or preparing for exchanges on the queenside, while also keeping an eye on the central tension created by white's e4 advance. This pawn push aims to reinforce the kingside and potentially prepare a g4 gram5 advance to gain space, though it does weaken the light squares around the king. The bishop repositions to g7, seeking a more active diagonal and supporting potential pawn pushes on the kingside while maintaining defensive coverage of the central squares. The move kh1 is a prophylactic maneuver, tucking the king away from the central files and potential discoveries along the b1h7 diagonal, thereby enhancing king safety and preparing for potential pawn advances. This move gently repositions the king to a safer square, away from the potential pressure on the g-file and supporting the g6 pawn, while preparing for a potential e4 pawn push later. This move begins a necessary pawn advance on the kingside to gain space and potentially open lines for the rook, as well as prepare for the king's safety on a more secure square. This move aims to activate the rook on an open file and support potential central pawn breaks, while also preparing to reposition the queen to a more active square. White repositions the rook to a more active square, aiming to support a potential kingside advance or control the g-file if it opens. This move repositions the rook to a more central file, preparing to contest control of the d-file and potentially support a pawn advance or initiate activity on the queenside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to support the kingside advance and potentially pressure black's queenside defenses. Black aims to reposition the rook to a more active square, potentially supporting a future pawn advance on the kingside or preparing for a coordinated attack along the a-file. Rethinking the plan, white repositions the rook to the g-file, preparing to challenge black's pawn advances on the kingside and potentially create weaknesses. Black aims to activate the rook on the e-file, preparing to potentially double rooks or support pawn advances on the kingside. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to exploit the open g-file and create attacking chances against the enemy king. This capture resolves black's central pawn tension, opening lines for their rooks while creating a more solid pawn structure for white, though it does leave black's kingside slightly more vulnerable to attack. This recapture of the pawn on d4 creates an unbalanced position with active pieces for both sides, continuing the tactical fight for central control and piece activity. This move challenges white's central pawn control and aims to open lines for black's pieces, particularly the rook on the g-file, creating dynamic counterplay. The move 37, Qf3 repositions the queen to a more active square, defending the g4 pawn while also preparing to potentially support a kingside advance or exploit the open central files. This move aims to defend the vulnerable f7 pawn and prepare to bring the rook into the game, potentially supporting a kingside pawn advance or controlling the open f-file. Qd5 centralizes the queen and targets the weak f7 square, preparing to exploit the open lines and black's slightly uncoordinated pieces. This move retreats the rook from the dangerous open file, aiming to regroup and defend the kingside while avoiding immediate capture. The queen retreats to f3, preparing to defend the f4 pawn and potentially relocate to h5 to target the black king. This move prepares to reinforce the kingside defense and potentially centralize the rook after white's queen repositions. This move centralizes the rook, preparing to support the kingside advance with the g-pawn and potentially challenge white's pawn majority. This move opens up a critical central diagonal for black's queen and bishop, aiming to exploit white's weakened pawn structure and create immediate threats. This move opens the g-file for white's rook and king, creating immediate attacking chances against black's uncastled king and potential mating threats. This move reclaims the pawn and activates the rook, directly challenging white's initiative and forcing a decision regarding the central tension. This move aims to regain the initiative by centralizing the queen and preparing to recapture the pawn on f5, potentially opening lines for white's pieces. This move seeks to improve the rook's position and potentially support a future g5 pawn advance, while also unpinning the piece from the g-file defense. This move repositions the rook to a more active file and supports the potential kingside pawn advance, aiming to create weaknesses in black's position. This move sacrifices the rook to open lines for the queen and potentially create mating threats against white's king, a bold attempt to inject dynamism into a seemingly stable position. The recapture of the rook on f3 opens the f-file for white's queen and creates an immediate threat against black's king, forcing black to defend precisely. This move creates a safe haven for the king, preparing to consolidate the position and potentially advance the queenside pawns later. The king repositions to a more secure square on g2, evading potential checks and preparing to support the central pawn majority or potentially assist in a kingside operation. The rook moves to f6, a defensive repositioning to protect the third rank and prepare for potential counterplay against white's d-pawn and the king. The queen repositions to defend the knight and prepares to support an attack on the kingside, while simultaneously maintaining control of the center. The king's move to h7 is a prudent defensive maneuver, creating an escape square and shielding the king from potential attacks along the g-file. This move repositions the rook to an open file, aiming to create pressure on black's kingside and potentially support a pawn advance later on. This move seeks to reposition the rook to a more active square, potentially aiming for the kingside or supporting further pawn advances on the queenside after the recent exchange. This move aims to create space for the king and prepare for potential pawn breaks on the kingside, while also preventing black from easily infiltrating white's territory. This move aims to activate the rook by bringing it to the d4 square, where it can contest the open file and potentially support a kingside initiative or a future pawn push. The move 49, Ka8 attempts to capitalize on white's improved piece activity and the pressure on black's weakened kingside, aiming to provoke further concessions or create immediate mating threats. This move aims to exploit the potential weakness on the queenside after white's pawn advance and to create counterplay by opening lines for black's rook. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside, potentially overwhelming black's defense in that sector and disrupting their coordination. This move captures a pawn but allows white to create a dangerous passed pawn on the c-file, potentially leading to a decisive advantage. White recaptures the pawn, aiming to stabilize the pawn structure and contest the open a-file. This move centralizes the queen to a more active square, supporting potential pawn advances and preparing to challenge white's control of the queenside. The queen repositions to a square where it can both defend the pawn on c5 and be ready to potentially support an advance of the rook on the b-file or even target black's king depending on the situation. This move repositions the rook to the f-file, where it can potentially exert pressure on white's king or create threats after further pawn advancements, aiming to exploit white's slightly exposed king. This move aims to reroute the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside advance or defending against black's pawn push on the queenside. The move h4 attempts to create luft for the king and potentially destabilize white's queenside pawn structure if white reciprocates with g5. This move, k1, repositions the queen to a more central file, preparing to support a potential pawn push on the kingside or defend key squares on the queenside. This checks the king and forces it to move, potentially disrupting white's defensive setup while simultaneously creating an opportunity for black to advance its passed pawn further. This move is a necessary defensive step to protect the king from the immediate check and maintain king safety, while also preparing to address the threatened knight on f3. This move capitalizes on the exposed king position after white's aggressive pawn push, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and exploit the lack of defensive pieces around the king. The rook's activation to the 7th rank is a powerful strategic decision, aiming to exploit the weakened king's position and control the open files, creating mating threats and potentially winning material. This move is a desperate, last-ditch attempt to create some sort of counterplay by forcing the white king into a discovered check situation, aiming to disrupt white's material advantage and potentially escape the current pawn deficit. The king's repositioning to h1 is a prudent defensive measure, creating a safer square and preparing for potential complications arising from black's active rook on f2 and the exposed king's pawn. This move is a powerful check that forces the white king back, aiming to disrupt white's current defensive setup and potentially gain material or a positional advantage by forcing further concessions.